2017, can Americans expect a tax cut?
I think so, yes. And I think before the end of the year, I would like to say yes.
All right, and I believe him. I believe that's what he wants to do. But I am telling you, increasingly, we are getting signs that this is not looking like such a done deal. Do not blame the president, but blame many Republicans around him who have differing ideas how they'll go about providing that tax cut, if they provide it at all. Growing indications of angst building in the financial community and elsewhere that this could get sort of scooted down the proverbial bench. No less than today's New York Post editorializing about a remix of past history when there were delays doing preferred legislation. Ronald Reagan himself found out the hard way that staggering this sort of thing and then delaying its impact resulted in 26 Republicans losing seats in the House of Representatives. Now, we all know in retrospect that Ronald Reagan came back, and so did Republicans. But again, if there was disappointment back then when the party was focused on this and nothing but this, what about now when the party seems to be all over the map on this? Let's get to Jerry Willis, our Fox Business Network superstar. We have Christy Stetzer joining us, Democratic strategist. Ned Ryan, American Majority CEO. All right, so Jerry, to you first. We're seeing more and more signs, not that they're capitulating on this, not that they're dropping this, but they are dropping the ball on this. The idea, the immediacy of doing something and being on top of it. That is my take. What is yours?
Well, I've been talking to people on the Hill today. I just spoke with Peter Roscombe, a congressman on the Ways and Means Committee, and he reminds me that Reagan's tax plans failed 3 times before they succeeded. It can take a long time, he says. And that goes to your point, right? How long will it take? It looks like Republicans are willing to wait it out to get the president on board with their ideas of border adjustment. But let me tell you, the stakes here are very, very high. Not just the stock market, but also the economy. To the degree that CEOs around the country don't see movement on these issues, I think you're going to have a long way to go to that 4% GDP growth.
All right, you know, Ned Ryan, I'm looking at this and I'm realizing, look, a lot of things can happen. It's a big deal when you want to repeal and eventually replace Obamacare, right. And that could be a multi-year effort. I understand that reality is hitting the road here, but I do think that with pushback comes more pushing these priorities back, making them less likely. Do you worry about that?
I do worry about it. We have been given a moment. We've been given an opportunity. Republicans are ascendant, not only in D.C., but in the governor's mansions and state legislatures at the local level. That's not going to last forever. That's the way of history is you have your ups and you have your downs. We're on the up right now. You have a window of opportunity, and I would actually argue it's about a 6 to 9 month window, because by the time we get into 2018, guess what? These guys on the Hill who are experts in self-preservation are going to be thinking about re-election, and this is the time for Trump to push. He's got the bully pulpit. He's got almost 90 million people that he's connected with on Facebook and Twitter. I hope that he unleashes them on these people on the Hill, because guess what? I've been in D.C. 16 years. The way that it has been with Republicans in D.C. for most of those 16 years, they have capitulated, they have surrendered, they have tried to moderate. Don't do that, and I hope that Trump realizes we don't have all the time in the world. Now's the time. Seize the moment.
All right, you know, Democrats, Christy, as you recall quite well, seized that moment when they had the run of the House and the Senate and the White House in their first 2 years of Barack Obama, and they took advantage of that. Now, many people might not like what they delivered, but they did have that run, and they did deliver the goods, and not goods that a lot of Republicans like. But if you look at this, Christy, and seeing what you're seeing now, I'm sure you would love to offer advice to Republicans, but what might it be?
I think, Ned, and you are exactly right. You look back at the first few months of the Obama administration, and they focused like a laser on the economy. They pushed through the Recovery Act. Some people even said that they should have focused on Obamacare first, that maybe it wouldn't have taken so long if they'd actually focused on that even before ARRA. So I believe that the Trump's administration's window here is extremely limited, and instead right now they look like the gang who can't shoot straight. You see leaks coming out from all over. There was a story, in the New York Times literally talking about them sitting in the dark because they didn't know how to operate the light switches. If that's not a metaphor, I don't know what is. Meanwhile, they are upsetting their conservative allies on the Hill. Democrats are furious with them for passing things like, for taking doing things like the Muslim executive order, the Muslim ban. So they are squandering this time right now where they could actually be pushing things through.
We can go back in history and say the roughshod nature of what Democrats did and how they did it ultimately, led them to losing seats, but 2 years later. Now we can go back and forth on this, but all I'm saying there is that people who had it sort of in their bonnet that this was going to be something that would be addressed immediately, let's say tax cuts, and now presidents get distracted. There are other developments that come up. This travel ban, delay, whatever you want to call it, the Supreme Court appointment, something that the president had to do. And I understand in Washington they can walk, talk, and chew gum at the same time, most of them. But again, the attention seems to have shifted away from tax cuts that look like a gimme to tax cuts that might not be such a gimme or a gimme so soon. What do you think?
Well, you're absolutely right. I think you just pound that nail on the head. Look, at the end of the day, you only have so much time. Even when you have both houses of Congress, you're owning the White House, you only have so much time to get your programs through.
Right.
And President Obama saw this very thing putting through Obamacare. The legislation came 5 months after he was into office, really pretty quickly. And so that's what needs to happen here. You've got to have a list of priorities and push for those priorities.
And I get a sense that, Ryan, that tax cuts might not be a big priority. I know what the president said to Bill O'Reilly. Now he outlined that he's still looking forward to that, still looking forward to dealing with health care.
Right.
But, he's new to Washington insofar as that window of opportunity. It seemed like we were mentioning the Super Bowl last night, and as you know, I'm a sports expert, but I can tell you as well that Tom Brady seemed to sense that the game was last night.
I would hope that Trump understands that sometimes you don't get a second bite at the apple. And nothing in politics moves unless pushed. And I hope that Trump pushes as hard as he can.
Well, I think he's depending too much on his Washington experts, his speaker and Mitch McConnell, who are guiding it. And I think they're guiding it in the typical way we do legislation. Slow.
This is the rub. I hope that Trump realizes he has the bully pulpit. The American people voted for him. The American people want to see common sense reform take place sooner rather than later. These guys are used to doing business as usual. That's not Trump at all. That's not how he ran his campaign. That's not how he's been doing it the last couple of weeks, for better or for worse. But he needs to understand if he sits and waits and relaxes and lets them push it, I'm telling you, I think he's going to miss a window of opportunity and needs to understand, leave nothing to chance, unleash everything that he can. I hope that he does tax reform. I hope that he does regulatory reform. I hope he keeps pushing on immigration reform. Repeal and replace Obamacare. He does all of these things. He's already gotten us a conservative Supreme Court judge. Keep going. Do not stop. Be overly aggressive. Some of my friends have said, well, I think he's being overly aggressive. You know what? I'd rather he be overly aggressive than not aggressive
enough.
Exactly.
So, Christy, you're looking at this and seeing this, and there was that point in selling the Affordable Care Act where Barack Obama was making it very clear to those who were, mucking around with this, it was his vision to implement his vision. Nancy Pelosi kind of would wince at the notion that it was Obamacare. She kept calling it the Affordable Care Act. But he got them to go along more to his vision than let's say theirs. Does Donald Trump have to do that on tax cuts since there's so many different opinions out there?
Yeah, he seems to be forgetting that old Dale Carnegie book, How to Win Friends and Influence People. I don't feel like he seems to be doing much of either right now. And I also don't know how much of a real priority this is for him. I mean, look, when he says, for example, that maybe we'll address the Affordable Care Act next year, to me that says that that's not so much of a priority. That could be the case with corporate tax reform as well. He has had a flurry of activity in the last few weeks. There's been lots of things that he's been incredibly aggressive on. I mean, I would say immigration has certainly been one of them.
Well, maybe he feels, I'll give him the benefit of the doubt on this, Christy. Maybe he feels that the best he can hope for, he wants to get a repeal and a replace fairly close together. And that if he were to move now on the repeal part, on which they all agree, the Republicans, then getting the replacement to deal with that gap is not so forthcoming. So to delay to make sure they're both together might be the strategy. But
which is a little embarrassing that there's nothing to replace with, right? But I mean, and
there's plenty to replace with. What they can't agree on is what. They have plenty of alternatives.
I mean, look, I mean, we are coming from basically Obamacare is Romney Care. It was, a product of the Heritage Foundation. What are you going to replace it with?
Come on.
Right?
All right, now, see, I want us to avoid being nasty with one another and take our cues from Tom Brady. All right, guys, thank you very, very much. I will not do my New England accent for at least another 5 minutes. All right, we are getting word from the White House here that it's very confident it's going to prevail in the president's executive order on refugees. As you know, this is a ping-pong effort with an appeals court judge saying essentially, no, you're overstepping your bounds. Maybe by tonight we'll have a reaction and an appeal reaction to that. Let's get the read on all of this with Ann Wagner, Missouri Congresswoman, Republican as well. Congresswoman, first on that, and do you think the president is within his authority to do what he wants to do on this order? Because at least one judge and a few other attorneys general have slapped him down. Where do you see this going?
He absolutely is on target on this. This is coming out of the Ninth Circuit Court, a left-leaning court. I think that has stayed this. The American people understand that we have a pause in place. It's not a ban. It's a pause, 90 days and 120, while we put some vetting in, while we go back over our procedures.
Well, isn't this
to make
judge
sure that
a
we're
Bush
safe.
appointee? I don't think he'd be considered left-leaning, but
I'd say the First Circuit and the Ninth Circuit are at war right now.
But you think he'll be overruled and that the president will be well within his bounds doing what he's doing? Do you think that this, regardless of what you think on this particular effort, Congresswoman, that it is distracting, though, that it is getting in the way of what we were just saying in the beginning of tax cuts, repealing and replacing the health care law, that Republicans might be spread thin on this?
Well, we in the House are full steam ahead, and I believe the president is too. I was with him in the Oval Office just last Friday when we were overturning what I'll call Obamacare for retirement savings. So the executive orders, the reg reform we've seen, the work on repeal and replace on Obamacare, the plans that are coming forward on real tax relief. This is important. And
when are they coming? The real tax relief stuff, you've heard in some of the lamenting going on here that they're not that they're dawdling, but their priorities are all over the map. What do you say to that?
The president says this year, and I take him at his word. I know that we're moving very quickly.
What is this year? Getting a tax proposal through or done?
Getting one done and through. 2017 is what the president is saying, and I know that we're moving towards that.
Do you think retroactive, Congresswoman?
Well, we'll see. I mean, I'll absolutely defer to Chairman Brady on many of those details that are moving forward. But the American people want something that's smaller, simpler, and that isn't taking care of all of these special interests. It's important to get the tax reform done so that we can, in turn, pay for some of the infrastructure spending and the things that the president wants to do. But I feel good about where we're moving. We have got a great Supreme Court nominee. What I'd like is for the Democrats to stop filibustering and stopping the president's cabinet choices. Those folks have got to get in place so that we can move forward with the agenda.
All right, Congresswoman, thank you for your patience with all of this back and forth. We'll see what happens. Again, that is just sort of a prevailing snapshot view of people who are a little anxious about the pacing of these events and whether it's going to come back to bite Republicans. Way too early to tell. But again, Ronald Reagan, of course, the hero of the tax cut movement, tried and failed a number of times and then had to compromise to get a tax cut that would be phased in over years, but not nearly in enough time for Republicans to lose a lot of seats in the House of Representatives in the midterm elections. And I should posit here, if the same thing were to happen now and the House actually flipped, can you imagine how receptive, let's say, Nancy Pelosi would be to any of this? Just saying. That's why this is their Super Bowl moment. It's really a horrible accident, isn't it? More after this.
We need strong programs so that people that love us and want to love our country and will end up loving our country are allowed in, not people that want to destroy us and destroy our country.
All right, that tough vetting process that now has become a sort of a constitutional football back and forth. The president got some support from soldiers in Tampa at the Southern Command. But one of the things that's come up in this discussion is whether it could come up in the next Supreme Court discussion. Judge Neil Gorsuch making the rounds there just moments ago, meeting with California Democratic Senator Dianne Feinstein, part of his reach-out effort to try to get confirmation hearings going sooner rather rather than later. The hope is that within the Trump White House to get him on the Supreme Court by April at the latest, mid to late April at the latest, so he could take up issues maybe like this one that's coming up right now, and the president's vetting order, and the back and forth we're going to be getting on that. Chris Gober is an attorney on this and other matters. Chris, what do you think that this ultimately goes to the Supreme Court? Right now we have 8 justices, so a lower court ruling would hold if it's a 4-4 tie. Anyone's guess how it would go if Gorsuch is approved and on the court. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think ultimately whether and when it goes to the Supreme Court is going to depend on which party wins in the Ninth Court Circuit of Appeals. I mean, right now, if you have the Ninth Circuit issue a stay, right, and effectively Trump wins at the Ninth Circuit, well, I think you could have the plaintiffs really trying to decide whether to take this en banc to the Ninth Circuit or go directly to the Supreme Court. But if you think about it in the opposite, if Trump in the DOJ lose and the stay is not granted, I think that it's in their best interest at this point to request an en banc hearing in the Ninth Circuit, have that full Circuit Court of Appeals review the case, delay before this goes to the Supreme Court to give time for Gorsuch to be confirmed in the Senate and be the 9th member of the court.
Would you roll the dice if you got an unfriendly appeals court decision, let's say, to go to the Supreme Court, hoping that Gorsuch is there, but not quite sure he will be, because in a 4-4 tie, to your point, I think at your point, because you're so smart, I barely understood that legal argument, but that the 4-4 that would hold to the earlier appeals court ruling.
Right. So if Trump loses at the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, that means when they go to the Supreme Court, they'll need 5 votes.
Right, right.
So waiting for Gorsuch to be on the court certainly increases those odds of them overturning the case.
What is your thought on just the constitutionality of a president ruling on something like this? This has somehow been, and you're the lawyer, I'm not, but been twisted into a Muslim ruling or an anti-Muslim ruling. If that were the goal, obviously the president could have opted to, go slow on those visiting from 46 nations around the world that have majority Muslim populations. He did not. He focused on the same 7 that Barack Obama did. Having said that, what is your sense of whether the president is in good legal standing?
Well, I think right now, in the case that's before the Ninth Circuit, I think there's a question of whether this is the one that's ultimately even going to be heard by the Supreme Court. Because if you think about it, the most controversial part of this executive order is what happens when the refugee ban is reinstated and the executive order says they are going to give preference to refugees whose religious status is of minority status from their country of origin. Okay. Well, right now, that is not being applied. That refugee ban is still in effect, and I wonder whether there is standing or rightness to even take that challenge to the court at this point. I think you could see the court deny it, say it's not right, and make the plaintiffs come back again.
Chris, thank you very, very much. Right now, the president arriving at Joint Base Andrews right now. Also, real quickly, 21st Century Fox is out, the parent company of ours. Shares down a little bit because sales missed a little bit, about 3% after hours. We'll have more after this. All right, you knew something was up earlier today when we first spotted Neil Gorsuch on the White House grounds. At first, we thought he was outside the White House looking for a place to eat. Turns out that was not the case. Making his rounds on Capitol Hill, among others, he met with today Dianne Feinstein of California, many others, as he tries to get ready for what the administration hopes will be confirmation hearings sooner rather than later, and maybe an approved seat on the Supreme Court by as soon as April. Washington Examiner's Gabby Marangiano with us right now. Gabby, what about that timetable? How likely is that he could be sitting and weighing and deliberating on cases, maybe in this whole ban issue, within a month or so?
Well, I think the more Democratic members of the Senate who sit down and meet with Neil Gorsuch, the likelier that timeline becomes of actually happening. I mean, today we saw him meet with Dianne Feinstein, a member of the Senate Judiciary Committee, who's expressed extreme doubts about him and his qualifications. He also met with John Tester, a Democrat from Montana, who, after the meeting, just moments ago, told reporters that he still hasn't decided whether or not he'll support an up or down vote on Gorsuch, but that he's encouraging his colleagues to actually, give him a fair shake, to sit down with him and hear from him. So I think the more Democratic members who actually take time to do that, to get to know him, to listen to him discuss what his positions on certain hot button issues might be, may be more inclined to actually give him a fair chance in the Senate and allow this timeline to be expedited.
Would he telegraph, some of the thornier issues and his positions on them? Most of these Supreme Court appointees, sort of punt on this sort of stuff. And when I'm thinking of the president's vetting plan for those visiting this country, his critics call it a Muslim ban, which he says is unfair. What would a Gorsuch say on that? They'd obviously try to pin him down. Obviously, that case could be an integral one because he could be ruling on it in April if it were to come to the Supreme Court. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, look, I don't feel comfortable predicting whether he would say that it is constitutional or not, but I do think that is certainly something that Democrats who are meeting with him and even Republicans who are sitting down with him are going to press him on. I mean, this is something that if it makes its way through the appellate courts or doesn't, it could end up at the Supreme Court level. Right. And if he is installed in that vacant seat by April, which the Trump administration certainly feels confident that he will be, it could be something that he's ruling on. So I would be shocked if it's not something that's coming up in these meetings with lawmakers.
Oh, I'm sure it's suddenly become an issue. Is it your sense that he'll get in by a majority, or will it have to be 60 votes? So how do you see this all sorting out?
Yeah, well, look, Dianne Feinstein said last week that Republican opposition to Merrick Garland, President Obama's nominee for the Supreme Court, really left deep wounds for her and her colleagues. So I think the big question that Democrats are asking themselves right now in terms of deciding whether or not they'll choose to filibuster him or support an up or down vote is, do I have significant and legitimate concerns about his qualifications, or am I behaving this way and planning to obstruct him simply out of spite? And I think that the more members, as I said, who sit down with him, who take time to know him and to understand that he is tremendously qualified for this position, may be more reluctant to pursue the strategy that Senator Schumer and Senator Merkley have outlined in just obstructing him without even, giving him a chance.
All right. Thank you very, very much, Gabby. Good catching up with you. The president is back at Joint Base Andrews. We're following that. Also following Iran when it says every time it uses missile technology, it does so for peaceful purposes and no nuclear intent. And you might buy that until you hear a footnote to that from Iran today that it is threatening to rain missiles on its enemies. Wait a minute. That doesn't sound peaceful. All right, I think I'm quoting this accurately. Iran now is warning to rain missiles on its enemies after new U.S. sanctions were imposed. Retired Army Lieutenant Colonel Tony Shaffer, that kind of cracks the case for him. Colonel, you've long been of the opinion that Iran couldn't be trusted, and sort of this type of bellicose talk proves it.
Well, look, the reality is a missile fired from Iran can reach the Israelis in 7 minutes. So, they've threatened the Israelis, a lot. So I think after a certain point, you have to understand that the technology they're developing is not for peaceful purposes. It's not like the drones last night with Lady Gaga. I don't think you're going to be seeing all these missiles flying around like a drone, so.
Right. And no one's going to be singing about it. But, Colonel, one of the things I wondered about here, we have these sanctions that the administration wants to push. But if memory serves me right, Iran has already gotten close to $100 billion of the money that was frozen. Maybe more, for all I know. But what's to incentivize them to behave if that's the goal here, or to get back in our good graces? If they've had that money, could they've cashed the checks?
Well, I think some of it ended up in like airplanes and big pallets, so that's gone. And you're not going to get that back. There's other things you can do regarding banking, regarding the fact that we can intercept money that travels through American banks that is of Iranian origin or where it's going. We can do things on that. And what they said, Neil, they violated, while, both sides have said They have not violated the Iranian nuclear agreement. They did violate UN sanctions relating to the missiles. So that does give the United States some level of leverage and justification for these actions. These actions aren't just being taken because
But why are
Mike
we
Flynn
the
and
only
Donald
ones
Trump.
taking such action? Because, I mean, if they violated these resolutions that the UN had set up,
Right.
then where's the clamor on the floor of the UN to sort of say, all right, well, you know, we can't believe they're doing this. We got to do something about this because we're the only ones who are right now.
I agree, and I think this is one of the things the Trump administration has to get behind. Nikki Haley just became the ambassador there. I think it's going to take some time for her to get going. Look, I know the fact that Mike Flynn and company have been doing a great job in trying to get themselves organized within the National Security Council. And look, I know DOD has options to deal with this, and some of those may be military, as was stated by Mike Flynn. Look, all these options are on the table, and
But
I think
how
Neil,
would
at this
military?
point,
What would be an example of a military option?
well, changing the MOE, the measures, the rules of engagement, the ROE. For example, one of the things that's been a complaint by those our ships and sailors in the region is that you have these mock swarm attacks where these small vessels, Iranian vessels, get up real close and do dangerous things.
Right.
Well, that's one thing. Another thing is that we do have the ability to intercept through the Aegis systems. We have these great cruisers called Aegis cruisers, which actually can fire a missile to knock down a missile. And if one of these things gets fired and is over territory that's not Iranian, we have the right to take a shot at it. So I think there's some things we can do to demonstrate that the bad behavior is not going to be tolerated. I just don't think this White House is going to be as accepting, if you will, of bad behavior.
Would we apply that if they try to strafe, as they did with Iranian rebel groups, the supporting attacks on Saudi ships in the air? Would that apply to the extension of our friends in the area?
I can say this. I don't know for a fact what the decision would be on something like that. But I remember I was talking to Michael Reagan a while back when President Reagan was asked about what to do when Libyan fighters were basically challenging our jets. Reagan's answer was shoot them down. I suspect that you may get a similar answer from Mr. Trump in a similar situation.
Wow. All right. Colonel, thank you. Always good chatting with you.
Thank you, Neil.
Meantime, President Trump, you think about it, has been in office all of 18 days. Now, apparently that is more than enough time for some Democrats to conclude the guy has got to be impeached. I kid you not.
I have not called for the impeachment yet. He's doing it himself. I think that he is leading himself into that kind of position where folks will begin to ask, what are we going to do? And the answer is going to be, eventually, we've got to do something about him.
All right. What she's saying is 18 days in, we should seriously consider grounds for impeachment. She tried to dial that back a little bit today, but not much. Fox News contributor Rachel Campos-Duffy on that. She's not the only one, Rachel. What are we to make of this?
Well, I mean, I guess what they're trying to do, and you see this at some of the town halls, for example, where, big crowds are showing up and congressmen are having to be escorted out. They're trying to say that this is about policy, the way the Tea Party was about spending or Obamacare. But it clearly isn't. This is about people who are having a big, giant venting session because they haven't coped with the fact that this man was elected president. And the reason, Neil, that I know that this is not about policy and that it's really about them being so angry about what just happened is that we didn't see any protests, for example, for the refugees when Barack Obama just out of nowhere on his last day out of office cut off the refugee status for thousands of Cubans who were escaping an evil dictatorship, who were left stranded in third countries, worried if they're going to be sent back there or not. Where were those protests? This isn't about some giant compassionate movement for the refugees. This isn't about climate change. This is simply them being angry about Donald Trump being elected, which is why they're already calling for impeachment.
Right. And she and others who are using that kind of language are citing these executive orders, yet not a one that I recall had argued taking the same action on Barack Obama's executive orders. They are a presidential right. You might not like presidents when they use it. Republicans certainly hate it when Democrats use it, and vice versa. But I think that is laying the groundwork for protests of this presidency because they are overreaching. What do you think of that?
Well, I'll tell you, I'm concerned about people like Maxine Waters and other people who are protesting, who are raising the temperature so high. I'm not just a Fox News contributor. I also happen to be the spouse of a member of Congress. And we have congressmen now that are being escorted by police who are afraid for their safety. We saw the violence at Berkeley, the kind of lessons that these students are being taught by their professors, the funding that's going behind this by radical progressive groups. These are not Birkenstock, peace and love liberals. These are the fruits of Bill Ayers and other radical progressive movements that often resort to violence. So I'm very concerned. And don't forget, Neil, when my husband was elected in 2010, 2 weeks later, a deranged Marxist shot Gabby Gifford.
That's
so
right.
I think the left needs to be very careful here about what they're fomenting, because the last thing we need is violence. And what these town halls and rallies are supposed to be about is civil dialogue.
Well, a lot of, to your point, are seeking out escorts, someone to be with them, a police escort, because it's gotten so dangerous. And 70-odd number of them had skipped out on the inauguration. That's one thing, but it's quite another to send a message to your constituents that the guy you don't like, they shouldn't like, that the guy you think is not a legitimate president, they should conclude is not a legitimate president. That is a dangerous, slippery slope.
It is. And don't forget, it was at the Women's March where we heard Madonna say that, you know, she dreamed of blowing up the White House. We've known that there are countless attacks on Trump supporters, including high school kids. So this is something, they're playing with fire. Absolutely. And again, I'll remind them, these are fathers, these are mothers, these are grandmothers and grandfathers. We need to treat them as public servants with respect and have an open political dialogue instead of all this craziness and violence and escalation.
All right. Good having you on, Rachel, even under these wacky circumstances. But everyone's got to turn down the octane here. Well, look at this. The world champion Patriots are back home in Boston. But again, we've been looking at jets that turned out not to be the said jet in question, which continues how this team has fooled America. I have no idea. But that could be the New England Patriots. Wow.